Today is one of the most connected voices in supply chain executive decision making. He has built a career turning complex cross-functional challenges into practical business outcomes. He has managed technical programs at places like NASA, but we were talking before this, and I wanted to just give you an opportunity to hear it from him. Because if you look at your LinkedIn profile, you're like, how did you get to here? So you explain it. You were explaining to me earlier, it'd be impossible for me to parlay that. And I think it's great coming from your voice. So ladies and gentlemen, Florian Selch.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jess, and thanks for having me. It's funny, when I look back at my background, I think I can make something up that makes sense, why I ended up where I am, but I could have never planned for that kind of a background because I started out in science technology, right? I ended up 6 years at NASA, but I also ended up being at NASA Ames Research Center, which happens to be in the middle of Silicon Valley. So now I got more pulled into this whole technology, investment, entrepreneurship world. So I was fascinated by that, and I decided I'm not going to double down into the science world, go for a PhD and end up with some very deep tech research. Instead, I shifted more into the business world. And what I always was interested in was actually more the connection or the disconnect in when tech-minded people communicate with business-minded people. So that was interesting for me. And you kind of see that in Silicon Valley. I think they're experts in making those connections there. I then moved on, worked in my family business and a couple other businesses in more corporate innovation roles. So there you see it again, right? You're like, we want to innovate, we want to do some cool stuff. But again, the tech person has some cool ideas, but cannot communicate it. So a CFO would get excited, right? And then if you take that a step further, that's what we're dealing with in supply chain too in today's world, right? There's a lot of innovation happening, a lot of excitement. You and I talked earlier about how that even changes the sales process, right? We need to rethink how we communicate some of this excitement. So is sort of the thread that I can see when I look at my colorful background is that communications and bringing people on the same page.
And now you've founded Masters of Supply Chain, which I'm happy to be participating in. I've really enjoyed my time there. I'm new, but I'm enthusiastic. Tell me a little bit about the founding of that and how that came to be and what it is that the mission of the products in the program.
Yeah, so the group came together actually during COVID. And so back at that time, everybody was struggling to just survive. When we brought that group together, the idea was always peer-to-peer learning, right? Like a platform where executives can come together and hear from their peers at this other company what they're struggling with, what they're trying, what's working, what's not working, right? And hear directly from them. Of course, everyone has Accenture and McKinsey and others on speed dial, but this is an opportunity to just directly hear from each other. And now fast forward to today, the focus has now shifted, right? We're past COVID. We're now in a very different environment. We're still with a lot of global disruption, but now the focus really has shifted much more towards automation, AI technologies, and not only trying to understand what these tools can do for me, but how can I actually apply them to address maybe some of these new challenges, right? Like how can I address the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is closed or that we have tariffs and we have various other issues, challenges? How can I apply technology to help with that? So that's really the shift that we have made and the tech focus that we have today.
And some of the roundtables I've been a part of, Masters of Supply Chain, you bring us a very senior group of people together. There's a whole host of people at these. I think it was at one not long ago, it was 700 people at it, but some very senior folks in the room. And so when you're talking to sort of executives in supply chain companies or brands and these stuff, what are some of the major things that you're hearing right now in terms of some of their challenges and concerns?
So I think all of them experience that pressure from the top down, from their boards and CEOs, like, hey, you got to do something with AI, right? Like that's something that started about a year and a half ago, and I think it still keeps going. And then they try to make sense of that and try to be careful and conservative. Supply chain people don't tend to be giant risk takers, right? They don't tend to be the ones that jump in and do some crazy stuff. They're the ones that keep the machine running and make sure it keeps running. And so now they're sort of the pressure's on to do some more innovative, crazy things. And so they try to balance that and the technology, just the speed of technology is just moving so fast, trying to figure out how do I keep up? How do I not miss out on an opportunity, but also how do I not make a big bet and then risk my operation being broken down and stalled? And I think that is really the struggle that where folks are in right now. And you can see that we invite a lot of technology experts like yourself to our group that are smart and innovative. They're like barely a year or two old, maybe well-funded, maybe not, but then they already work with PepsiCo, right? Or some other big one. That's like, they are pre-Magic Quadrant, right? Like they're not picked up yet by anybody. So naturally, I'm curious, right? Like, what is it that made PepsiCo work with this very young company? And so this is where I think some of that tension is of, I don't want to miss out on this, but if I bet on that wrong company, then I may majorly get screwed.
Yeah. And it's such a tension in the market right now, as we talked about this earlier today too, is that how do we take those bets? Because what you just described is that's a pretty new thing, right? For me, I've been in this space for 20 years and thinking about Pepsi working with I don't know, I'm just going to make something up, but 10-person startup that's basically $3 million of revenues. And that would have been unheard of not long ago. So it really does speak to the desire, I guess, to move fast, because I suppose what you're describing almost is there is this recognition that it's almost like we're shifting from tech, like as much as technology is, of course, it's a competitive advantage. I think in the enterprise, everything tend to be measured on a spreadsheet. So it's still, everything boils up to a cost center. But it feels like with this new AI shift, the amount of innovation money that's opened up and this type of capital that's out there for taking bets, this is something I haven't seen in my career, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a bigger desire, but I also think it's so interesting how this constantly shifts with how much money is available for supply chain. Like during COVID, anything was possible, right? There was unlimited amounts of money just to get us through COVID and survive. Now we're in a slightly different post-COVID world where budgets tightened up again, but now there is another opportunity again with AI. But since we're talking budget, I think another thing that people start to realize, I think, wasn't it Uber that was very innovative with a lot of AI applications, and then within 4 months, I think, blew through its tokenization budget for the year, right? Yeah. So that's another budget consideration where it's like, yes, I think AI tools, they can provide a ton of productivity enhancement. Again, I'm a power user myself, but then there is another cost factor coming in, which is tokens. This stuff does cost something, and you may not realize that at the beginnings once you make a big bet or a big shift changing your process.
Based on what you've heard and what you've seen, like I guess these are the things that people are kind of willing to do. So that Pepsi is willing to work with the startup. It's like, what are these startups positioning to these enterprises, these corporations, that's actually getting them to that? What are people buying today? What a promise are they purchasing?
Well, the good question is, what promise are they purchasing and what are they actually getting, right?
Maybe that's the follow-up, but yeah, let's see. Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of excitement, a lot of hype, a lot of too much promise, maybe. There is certainly a down the road vision, which I'm excited about as well, where like this thought experiment, could I run a giant company like PepsiCo as like a one-person organization? And what I mean by that is like, could that future look like where every one of my systems is perfect, right? All of my data is perfect. Everything is interconnected. And all I need to do is I need to be like, okay, bot number one, tell me about some new beverage flavors we should design for this year. Oh, I like the first one. Perfect. Bot number two, please prepare my manufacturing plans and start buying the ingredients, et cetera, right? There is a world where all of that could theoretically be fully automated, but we are pretty far from that. And I think the realization is because of the complexity in such of these giant companies, especially, it's just not that easy to just simply flip a switch and suddenly all of the tools and systems talk to each other. That is what is being sold, right? That is what is being promised, is I connect all of your systems together, sort of like the layer above. I can give you enhanced, augmented, or fully automated decision-making that will help you run your operation much more efficient. Your planning will be much more real-time to your execution. And yes, to some extent, it does work, right? And I would say medium-sized or small-sized businesses, like you said as well, they may have an advantage in all of this. They are a little more nimble. They maybe don't have legacy systems to deal with. So there may be an advantage for them. But this is something that we do see that there is promise and some initial steps being made, but we're not at a point yet where everything is just fully automated and run by bots.
Is there a risk, do you think, with some of the enthusiasm from some of the vendors in terms of what they can do versus what actually happens in practical reality? Do you sense any pullback or sort of enhanced skepticism entering this market at all?
Yeah. I think over the last year and a half or so, I think a lot of companies have experimented with AI tools, lots of brands and executives, and lots of them got burned, right? Like lots of them wasn't that MIT report, I think, where it's like 95% all AI initiatives failed, right?
You're curious about the 5%.
The 5%. Yeah, exactly. So I think that causes hesitation, right, to set in and people thinking twice. What they want in addition now, lots of folks still go to Manifest and other conferences and they see just tons of new tech companies, agentic AI, all of these promises. But then I think at Manifest alone, we had 1,500 companies. Like, how am I supposed to work myself through this giant list of companies? So I think the excitement is still there. I don't think people are like suddenly, okay, I'm not going to do it anymore. They're probably a little more careful. To your earlier point, I think it changes the skill set that you need to have in an organization to work through these companies and how do I evaluate them, right? Because I mean, you're a tech guy, you've worked in the sort of startup technology industry for a long time. For you and for investors, VCs, that's their bread and butter. How do I look at a team, right? Are they ready to scale? And what are the risks? Somebody who is a supply chain leader, executive, somebody in logistics, they know everything about LTL and FTL, but they've never evaluated a startup before, right? That's not part of the job description. And so there's a lot of new skills that are being required now. The tech decisions used to be made by the IT department, right? Now that onus falls on the business leader, on the function leader of supply chain. And so there's quite a bit of learning needed for them to then make comfortable decisions. Nobody ever got fired for implementing SAP, but I'm sure lots of people got fired for implementing some immature AI tech companies.
They should get fired for implementing SAP. You're kind of hitting on something. I think the subtext here is around trust, right? There's this trust gap. And we talk about a lot of that in our business today too, because we think a lot about how to close that trust gap. And I think you've got a lot of, we'll call it like sort of misinformation. You've got this like perfect storm in terms of lots of aspiration, budget, kind of mixed with like hope is deadly, right? Like, so there's the hope that I can get something. Hope sells so beautifully. So you have startups creating this kind of hope narrative, and you've got these buyers looking to attach themselves to set outcomes, attach themselves to hope, which is leaving some bodies in the street. And I think potentially at least creating some hesitation maybe downstream. And we're creating a bit of a trust divide here. And so I think this is where I think things like Masters of Supply Chain are so effective at helping bridge that gap. So when you think about the conversations that are creating value, and what is it that's happening in Master Supply Chain that like an analyst report or a presentation can't really satisfy? I think it's doing a phenomenal job at helping at least put some lean into closing that trust gap a little bit. So maybe just in your own words, like what is happening there?
Yeah, one of our participants a couple months ago made a funny comment. He is like, I love joining you guys in this group because it feels like a group therapy session to me. And it feels like I hear from my other executives in these other companies and they're struggling the same way I'm struggling. So I feel less alone, right? I feel less FOMO, or I feel like less like I'm behind, because that's really interesting. I mean, honestly, there are a few players out there that are really advanced. They're really far ahead. They got their data in order and they're just plugging in new systems. But the majority of companies out there, they're not, right? They're at somewhat of a similar maturity level, but they think they're all missing out or behind because that's what everybody else says and is talking about. And every podcast you listen to, you know, what amazing things AI can do for you. And they're like, well, I'm still working on a spreadsheet here, right? So there's a bit of that disconnect here. And I think being in our group helps them benchmark a bit with others and see where everybody else is at. You mentioned analyst reports. Of course, they're important for certain topics and subjects and so forth. And in contrast, then it's also really good to hear directly from somebody else, from a peer, right? Like an analyst report will tell you 7 out of 10 chief supply chain officers want to do X this year. We have the chief supply chain officers in the room and you can just talk with them directly and compare notes and benchmark. And I think that brings that human element back into a world of technology, a world of information overload, where it's just hard to trust, you know, what do I trust? What kind of information? What does work? What doesn't work? Here, at least I can be like, okay, I spoke with these guys and they have worked with this solution and they told me that this worked or this didn't work, right? And hearing that firsthand, I think that is probably one of the most important things that we provide.
Yeah, we talk about this shared learning, and I think that it's old is new again in many ways, as far as I'm concerned. And I think we are going to see a resurgence in these types of events, forums. I think, again, human to human connection is going to come back with a vengeance in sort of the face of all of this innovation. We're going to need a place to go. And I'm really encouraged by what you guys are doing. I've been such a fan. I love the whole setup and the whole forum and the casual nature of it and the consistency of it. And you guys do a really good job covering kind of all various topics. And honestly, some are more interesting to me than others. I look at some of them like that, probably won't go to that one, but some of them are they write for me and I listen to them. I've invited my customers to them as well, because I think they can get a lot of value as practitioners and there's a lot of value for them. It's interesting because these types of forums typically, for me, and I think for many of us who are commercially oriented, we'll look at things like this and say, okay, how many leads are there? But I think if we sort of step back and recognize that the learning that comes later by doing good work and by creating value, like you'll get there. But, sort of upon going to my first session that you'd hosted, it just kind of felt a little bigger than that in a sense. I didn't feel a pressure to hunt customers down or write people's names down who were on the call and like spam them. I just felt like wanting to listen and wanting to learn. And that felt good enough for me. And I don't know, as someone who's very sales sort of oriented, that was very refreshing for me. So I think you guys have done a really good job at just building something that feels very approachable and very value added, I would say.
I appreciate all the praise and I'm glad you're finding the sessions valuable. I mean, a couple of points you brought up. Frequency, I think that's an interesting one. We're hosting sessions pretty much every 2 weeks. And the reason is simply the speed of technology, right? It's just moving so fast. A once a year summit wouldn't cut it. Now, having said that, I'd love getting together in person. We've hosted dinners before. I'd love to do a summit once a year and get face to face with people. But yeah, the importance is you have to be really on that pace with technology, with innovation. And that only happens if you're really meeting on a regular basis. In terms of topics, I think that you brought this up too. It's like some things are more interesting, some things are less. We covered the end-to-end supply chain, right? And it is interesting, like we could have called it masters of logistics, right? Or we could have done masters of procurement and stick within a function. The nature of supply chain is getting more end-to-end. I think automation, AI, technology enables a lot more of that end-to-end as well. I encourage people that are function leaders to also not go to the sessions of their function, but the other functions as well, because you need to start optimizing for the end-to-end, right? And even if I'm a director of inventory management, I need to think of like, how do my decisions impact procurement, logistics, et cetera. So I think that's another reason why we have the setup as we have it. And again, I appreciate all the good feedback.
Well, I think your point's valid though. I probably should take that advice myself because it's a chain, right? In that each link is connected. Everything is all connected to each other. So there is no really independent operating department within the supply chain. So there is this co-relationship up and down. So, maybe it's good feedback for me to join the procurement one, for instance, which I think I skipped because I was like, well, that doesn't apply to me, but you're exactly right. It does probably apply to me, and having that insight would inform other things I'm talking about and just heighten my education, which to me, I'm always looking to do anyway. So that's actually good feedback.
What I like about what you just mentioned, right? Like joining another session that is sort of outside my day-to-day. I think what that represents is, yes, we're moving more towards this like end-to-end supply chain, but we're also coming out of the historic silos of supply chains, right? Like of each function.
Yeah.
Now we're getting more end-to-end connected. But you actually brought up an interesting point earlier, which is if I only apply automation and AI to my function, I'm starting to recreate the silos essentially. And I become even more entrenched. I think it's really interesting to then say, I need to open up my mind also to understand that you make sure we're enabling that end-to-end with technology and not just recreating the silos.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said by me earlier.
Exactly.
So now we do rapid fire questions. I'm sure you've seen this pony show before. Okay, so what is one sign a transformation effort is actually working?
One is you got to just tie it to an actual KPI ROI, right? We need to actually save money or show it in the language of the CFO. So that to me is always the most important one, to actually show that it's working. Everything else kind of comes after that.
What is one question more executives should ask before choosing a technology partner?
It's hard to ask just one question, but I would say the different framework to look at providers now is more of that lens of a VC. I think that to me is the more important. What used to be the RFP, RFQ process is now in many, many cases a VC type of evaluation. That's more than just one question, but that's at least the lens that I think is required today.
Okay, so I know this is rapid fire, but you got to say a little bit more on that. It's a super interesting take. What does that mean?
The old school process is it's much more of like, here are our requirements, right? And let me send it out to 20 companies and they write me something back and I pick the best one. I think today, because we're dealing with such early stage companies, like we said earlier, PepsiCo working with somebody who was only a year or two old, how do I evaluate that, right? Like, how do I evaluate their technology, the risk working with them? I need to look at things like the team. Who is behind this? What backgrounds do they have, right? What is their funding situation, right? As a supply chain leader, I don't know what a Series A is or a Series B is, right? This is lingo. These are frameworks and questions that I'm not used to. So understanding, okay, here's a set of 10 questions that a VC would ask a startup to consider investing into that company. That's now the lens that I need to have, is here my framework of 10 questions, as if I'm investing as a supply chain leader, which I am, right? I am investing into this company to work with me and to hopefully not screw up my operation down the road.
This is a super interesting take, and I actually quite like that. Okay, so next question. What is one supply chain assumption you think deserves to be challenged right now?
I think one assumption we could look at is being discussed a lot in our roundtables is better forecasts. You need to have better forecasts, right? Like that's the goal, the solution. And a lot of our conversations then steer towards, no, you just become more agile, more flexible, faster adaptability. That's one of the things that the real-time planning to real-time execution piece. And that seems to be real, right? Like there's some real progress made in this space.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there is a forcing function of a very unpredictable, volatile world we find ourselves in. So predicting the future has become increasingly more challenging. So the idea of forecasting has become increasingly more pointless, to be very broad in this statement. It's that it's good to have when all things work the way they're supposed to work. But I felt like we've had a lot of black swans in the last half decade that would make forecasting probably pretty fragile and very, very difficult. So yeah, I think that's a super interesting point. Okay, what is one piece of advice you'd give to an executive trying to make better supply chain decisions without a perfect playbook?
Let's focus on innovation decisions. Sure. To be honest, I think that the way to look at it differently is this way of experimentation, which is sort of a startup Silicon Valley type of a quality. We celebrate failures because we learn from failures. That's not necessarily a mindset that you would find in supply chain organizations, because a failure may mean total catastrophe. But if you can bake that into an organization where you set up environments to encourage people to experiment more and then learn out of that process, learn out of the failures, right? Like allow those failures to happen. I think that would be critical now that we're again in a world of uncertainty of technology. We don't know how this stuff is going to develop. But if you don't want to be left behind, you got to start, and then you got to manage that uncertainty with that sort of an environment.
Yeah, great feedback. And then lastly, where can people find you, follow along with what you're doing?
MassiveSupplyChain.com. Find us on LinkedIn. We don't have much of an external presence because really everything we do is referral based. People who are in the group connecting us to others in the group. That's sort of the magic sauce here, is that we know who is in the group and we want to keep it that way. But having said that, we're not excluding new people. If somebody's interested, please reach out. We want to have conversations. We want to meet new people. So send me a message on LinkedIn and I'm happy to connect.
Okay. Well, Florian, that was amazing, insightful. I love some of those lines. So thank you for that. And I know it's a referral group, and I don't want to say an exclusive club because that would sound bougie, but you do have to apply to get in. So appreciate you putting yourself out there today. Lovely speaking with you for this. And we did one earlier for those listening. So Florian, I've been hanging out for the last 2 hours, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Same here. Thank you, Justin.
Hey man, take care.